Hello and welcome to American Friction, the really non-partisan podcast, which doesn't take anyone's side.
Not a single side taken.
No, I'm not on your side. I'm Jacob Jarvis.
Well, I'm not on your side, and I'm Chris Jones. As we say, we talk a lot about Trump and the GOP and everything they're doing wrong a lot on this podcast. But let's be honest, the Democrats ain't so perfect either, are they, Jarv?
No, they're not. So today we're going to focus on the Democrats and ask, what the hell is going on with them? To do that, we are joined by Elena Schneider, national political reporter at Politico, who covers the 2028 presidential campaign and the Democratic Party. Hi, Elena.
Hey, thanks for having me.
First question I wanted to ask you really is about this shutdown situation. So it seems like a lot of people are pretty annoyed at the Democrats who decide to defect and end up voting on what we're seeing go through at the moment. What's the mood like among Democratic lawmakers after that? A deep breath needed probably sums up the mood. Yeah.
Well, part of what is so wild about this moment is that, just a week ago, Democrats won sweeping victories in what we call off-year elections. So in 2025, obviously we don't have everybody up for election, but there's some key ones in New Jersey, Virginia, but then also some stuff down ballot in Pennsylvania, state Supreme Court races, Georgia, California, this big redistricting ballot measure. Democrats not only won everywhere, but put up humongous margins. And there was really clear sort of evidence that voters were on their side, just not only in frustration with the Trump administration, but also on this shutdown as well. And there was even some evidence from Donald Trump, he self-proclaimed that the shutdown was going to be a problem electorally for them. And so for Republicans. And so it seemed like a very odd moment for then these 8 senators to decide to basically accept the terms of reopening the government without any serious concessions. And the response to it has been almost universal frustration, rage, anger at these 8 senators, but also at what they really represent in a lot of ways. And this speaks to much bigger divisions that have been dividing the Democratic Party, particularly in the last 9 months to a year, but more broadly, honestly, for the last 4 or 5 years. And one could even argue going all the way back to Bernie Sanders. But there's been a real frustration with the leadership of the Democratic Party and this sort of establishment belief that you can sort of operate within the normal rules of the game, that you can treat Trump and Republicans as good faith actors. And that's in a lot of ways what these 8 senators, all of whom age-wise average about 70 years old, sort of said. They basically said we weren't getting anything more out of the shutdown. They were seeing the scenes at airports where people's flights were getting delayed or canceled. Thanksgiving is looming. And far more painfully for families, access to SNAP benefits, which is federal money that goes out to families who qualify, who can't make enough money to pay for groceries. The pain was being felt in a very, very real way because this was the longest government shutdown. But even so, this decision to give in to Republicans to end the shutdown has reopened all of these divisions that just a week ago seemed like everyone was on the same page within the party. And now we've restarted this process of everyone being like, what are we doing here?
What is it that unites those 8? Because to me, one thing seems to be overarchingly that they don't have very much political future. A lot of them are retiring. They're not going to stand again. Is that basically what's made them club together? Because they don't have the jeopardy that a lot of other people have. But then still, that at the same time, you think could cut the other way, that they don't have to worry about political consequences of anything they do. So therefore just do the right thing. I'm not sure. What binds them? I don't get it.
So what binds them is a lot of what you said. One, which is that none of them are going to be standing for election next year. So some of that is because they're retiring, like Dick Durbin from Illinois, and others who just are not up because they serve 6-year terms. So they were protected in sort of the immediate near-term political backlash of getting a primary challenger. And I think, look, you talk to Democrats privately on the Hill, and there is a feeling that there was no real clear exit strategy out of this shutdown in which they could get some, agreement on extending ACA subsidies. John Thune, who leads the Republicans, Mike Johnson in the House, who leads Republicans in the House, were very clear they were not going to do it. So what are you ultimately fighting for is basically where these 8 senators landed, which I think is a fair, it goes back to like, why did they all get into the shutdown to begin with without a clear exit strategy? And so that's why I think that even though it triggered a ton of anger and backlash, and particularly sort of the timing of it happening right after the election where they won all of these elections and clearly had the wind at their back, that there is a feeling that even some Democrats within the Senate caucus are kind of happy that they took this vote and honestly took sort of the blowback themselves. A key person to watch in all of this and how he's acted is Senator Jon Ossoff. He's very young. He represents a pretty red, vaguely purple Georgia. And he's arguably, not even arguably, he is the most vulnerable Democratic senator who's going to be up this year. And he didn't vote with them. He didn't go with the deal. He decided to vote against it. And in some ways, he gets the benefit of them taking these arrows because he can vote against it, which makes the Democratic base happy. It shows him as a fighter. But also he gets a little bit of the benefit of just simply the shutdown ending here. Because in the long term, these Democrats generally are arguing now that they're sort of in day 2 or 3 of trying to recover from what's next after the shutdown is they're arguing that even though they lost this battle, they lost the shutdown battle, that they have ultimately propelled healthcare and cost of living to the forefront of the conversation for the last 6 weeks, and that they will ultimately win the war over healthcare costs and who to blame for that, and that they've cemented in the minds of voters that's who to blame. So there are a lot of cross currents here of like why these 8 senators decided to make these moves, what they were sort of protected from electorally themselves, and just sort of generationally where they come from. They're all older, and what maybe they get in protecting some other members by taking this vote themselves and deciding to end the shutdown.
This is a tough question, but it's kind of straightforward. What's John Fetterman's deal? Because he's like not that much older. He's like 56 or whatever, which is, actually fairly young by Senate standards, I suppose. What's his deal? I don't know what this guy's all about.
I think a lot of voters in Pennsylvania feel the same way. I should say Democratic voters in Pennsylvania feel the same way. I mean, look, this is, in this time of interesting characters in Washington, there's a lot of people who pretend to be mavericks but aren't. John Fetterman really is in a lot of ways. I mean, he's somebody who, was mayor of Braddock, Pennsylvania, which is a teeny tiny Western Pennsylvania steel town, and rose up to be a lieutenant governor, ran for Senate, and has always sort of had this like very I'm an outsider, profile, which a lot of people run on, but don't necessarily actually act on when they get to Washington. He's lived it out. And I think in some ways, people are incredibly frustrated by that within the Democratic Party because he is more willing than most to reach across the aisle and work with Republicans. And important to note in all of this is he suffered a stroke in the middle of his election. And, I'm not a doctor, but I do think that there is some sense that changes a person's personality. And it's been fascinating to sort of see how that has manifested for him in the way that he's operated on the Hill. And I think he's just somebody who likes to be apart from his party in a lot of ways. He
was also on Fox News recently promoting his book, I think, which I found a little bit strange. But just sticking with figures, or lack of, I guess here, Elena, who's really in charge when it comes to the decisions that the Democratic Party is making as a unit? Because it doesn't feel like anyone.
And you're right. There is no one.
Right.
There's no one in charge. I mean, that's truly the answer, because who leads parties gets decided in presidential primaries. And the ultimate presidential nominee and whoever is in the White House is the one who leads the party and who has the megaphone, the platform, the political power to push a party in one direction. And Democrats don't have one. And not only do they not have one, I mean, in 2016, when Hillary Clinton lost, Barack Obama had just obviously ended his second term, was still broadly pretty popular. Yeah. And he didn't poke his head out a lot, but he was still certainly behind the scenes involved in some of the directional aspects of where the party was going. In some ways, there is no figure like that. No Democrat is asking Joe Biden to come out and campaign for them. Yeah. And actually, honestly, even these last elections in 2025 that happened a week ago, The closer, the person who came in to get people to come out and vote that final weekend, was Barack Obama. No one asked Kamala Harris. Nobody asked Joe Biden. It was to reach back to somebody who won almost a decade ago. And I think that speaks to the lack of a central leader or figure in the party. One could argue, and Democrats certainly do argue, that that's maybe not a terrible thing in this moment. Things went really badly in 2024 for them. They lost across the country. They saw losses in blue states across every racial and geographic demographic that you can go through. And so in some ways, this is exactly the time for them to kind of just figure it out. And yes, it's a little bit of like the blind leading the blind in some ways. And you're going to have moments like this where there wasn't a ton of thought or strategy going into this shutdown process or how to get out of it. But nonetheless, I think that also allows for voters and the party to sort of figure out who is the best person to lead going forward. And by not having sort of a clear front runner or not having somebody who's going to weigh in with a big voice makes all of this, for reporters like me, a lot more exciting.
Well, you mentioned her there, Kamala Harris, and she kind of disappeared for a little bit after the election, but then she's cropped up again. She's got a book to sell, so she's been doing the media rounds. We tried to get her, but she said no.
Yeah, she's ignored us so far.
Who'd have thought it?
Brutal.
I know. But,
I said I didn't think she'd win the election, so
we got it right,
didn't
we? But she's kind of in and around things. I mean, I guess the question I'm trying to ask is, do people within the Democratic Party, whether they're the electorate or whether they're actually within the party, do they see her having a kind of figure leadership role in the future for, well, let's say the midterms even, because that's the closer. Do they see her having any kind of integral role for the Democrats going forward?
I think that there is still parts of the Democratic base who think Kamala Harris got a pretty raw deal. And this is what Harris certainly posits in her book and her memoir, that basically she was, from the jump, that she had no shot here. She didn't have enough time. There's no way she was going to turn the ship around. And I think that there's some who probably agree with her. But I would say the vast majority of the Democratic Party, and this is borne out in polling. I mean, Politico just a couple weeks ago had a poll asking Democratic voters, who's the leader of your party? And she came in third behind no one and I don't know.
Wow.
Great.
That's pretty telling about how people feel about her. And I think that there is this feeling in primaries across the country right now of like, if you're establishment coded, if you're somebody who is seen as being tied to Washington or the way that things have been or the status quo, that is a mark against you in a way that it didn't used to be. And I think that the same will probably apply in 2028, where we've got Democrats wanting somebody who feels fresh and new and different, and Kamala Harris inherently represents the past. And that's going to be something really hard for her to get over if she ultimately decides to run for president again.
It feels like almost she's going to have to reinvent herself and what she stands for, and also just campaign completely differently away from Charlie XCX. Let's be honest, that probably wasn't the wisest move. But Harris aside, let's go back to the election. Is there a consensus or a clear consensus about what actually went wrong from a Democratic perspective? Harris aside, is there anything else you think that was, broadly agreed upon by the party that it was the issue?
Guys, you are asking the questions that are keeping up Democrats still to this day.
No, we know you can't answer them, but are they trying to answer them?
That is the answer, though, isn't it? I guess.
That's it. I mean, I think that part of what is fascinating to watch after now having covered American politics for more than a decade at a very close-up level is that when somebody wins, there is not a ton of examination about how and why. And when somebody loses, all they do is talk about it. And everyone is to blame, right? Everyone has a different story for why their thesis of what went wrong or what went right is the correct one. And they cherry pick evidence to prove out their points. So we're still very much in that phase where I've probably written a half dozen stories at this point about various postmortems of the Democratic Party corpse that they're trying to bring back to life. And what's really interesting is where the different sort of veins of the party go. So you've got one camp who think Kamala Harris was too liberal, was seen as too liberal by voters. She had this really devastating attack ad put on by the Trump campaign where they used something that she said during the 2019 presidential primary about transgender reassignment surgeries. And the tagline was Kamala Harris is for they, them. And that she was too liberal on social issues and they never focused enough on economic issues. That's one camp. Then you've got another camp saying, and that tends to be and that's maybe a little more moderate. Then you've got progressives who say she also agreed that she didn't talk about the economy enough, but in fact was too sort of corporate friendly, that she wasn't leaning hard enough into sort of big, bold ideas about how to shake up the way that our government works and was way too content with the status quo. That's one thought. Another is she focused too much on democracy, small d democracy in the closing weeks of her campaign, and did her final speech at the Ellipse and was banking on people thinking again about January 6th when they went to the polls, when in reality a lot of people think about how they can afford childcare, how they can afford paying gas, that's often what ultimately people decide on. And so there's a lot of different theories for how this went. But I think what's really interesting and what I think you guys should keep an eye on is that there's a vanishingly small path for Democrats if they continue to only focus on winning what we call the blue wall states. So these are traditionally Rust Belt Midwestern states. So that's how you get to 270 electoral votes, by winning Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And it's getting increasingly hard for Democrats to rely on that path. And if they can't figure out where else they're going to win and in what other states they're going to win, they're kind of assigning themselves to a permanent minority, particularly in the Senate. And I think what's going to be fascinating are who are the groups and who are the people trying to figure out how to win in places that they haven't won, either before or in decades. And that's going to be what I think is going to be really fascinating in the next 5 to 10 years.
Just back to the Senate for a moment. I'm sorry that my questions might as well just be people's names and me then going, huh?
What's happening with that?
Chuck Schumer. How does this keep happening to Chuck Schumer? It just keeps happening to him. How does he still have the job? And how does he, when he keeps the job, does this just keep happening to him over and over?
So I will start by saying it's never fun to be in the minority, and it's really not fun to be in the minority in the Senate. There's just not a lot of levers that you get to pull to affect change. That being said, though, there have been some really interesting decisions that he has made. And you're hinting at also, I think, the back in March where they agreed to a continuing resolution that Schumer, signed on to, basically seemingly without a ton of thought or strategy about how to talk about it, about how to message on it. And people got really pissed off. And I think and that's part of why we then see them choosing to make this massive shutdown strategy choice now here this fall, because they saw the backlash in March. He felt the backlash in March. And so I would say two things. One, he is in his 70s. He still uses a flip phone. He is a creature of a different time. He truly is. He is a creature of a different time that, for a younger generation of Democrats, hoping will exit stage left. And we've seen, led by Joe Biden in terms of age problems, but then Nancy Pelosi not only stepping back, but now saying she's not going to run for re-election this year. Chuck Schumer is sort of who's left in terms of the old guard senior citizens. And that's ultimately what he is. And so I think that we can't ignore that sort of frame of reference that he's coming from generationally. And then second, a lot of his decisions can't be seen without the larger context of the reality that he faces re-election in 2028. So not this year, or this coming year, I should say, but in 3 years. And there has been lots and lots of talk about him getting a primary challenge from Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And I think that the belief is she would run the table if she were to challenge him. And so I think that there's some sensitivity not some, there is a ton of sensitivity to that, to that potential reality. And he's in the way that he's making all these decisions too.
Do you think that his stance around Mamdani might make that more likely as well, Theo? So I saw Zohran Mamdani got asked, should Schumer be primaried? And he kind of ignored the question, but that sort of loudly felt like, if you ignore that question, you probably think yes. But Schumer was very hesitant around giving support to Mamdani. Do you think that is gonna tee this up? Because at the moment, it does feel like if the political winds are behind anyone in the Democratic Party, it is people like Mamdani and AOC and that more sort of younger left-wing contingent. Once again, is Schumer, with his just constant caution, actually putting himself in more danger?
I think that you're totally right in that the wind and energy is behind more progressive, more leftist candidates and members, but in blue states is the only asterisk I would add, because that's a reality here too of rarely, if ever, do Republicans win statewide in a place like New York. And so for him, he really has to face a primary. Yeah, I will be what his decision is and whether he decides to run again come 2028 will be fascinating. And I do think that he kept, as did Hakeem Jeffries, who is the leader of the Democrats in the House, also a member from New York. They both kept Mamdani at arm's length the entire time. Some of this is about the Israel-Gaza politics and what, Schumer obviously is Jewish. Hakeem Jeffries has really strong ties to that community as well. Donors were super pissed about the way that Mamdani talked about the conflict in Gaza. And so, I think that plays into this a lot as well, not just sort of his primary calculations, but I think that they also kept him at length because of that and because of that sense that he didn't sort of go as far or moderate as far as they would have wanted him on that issue. And for Schumer in particular, that's very personal. So yeah, I mean, it's that dynamic, and that dynamic in New York is going to be a really crazy one to watch.
So it seems to me when it comes to the attacks we're seeing on Mamdani, they always lump into basically two categories for the most part, and it's either over his stance on Palestine or it's people saying he's a communist. Do you think that those two issues are actually people's biggest concerns with him, maybe, or are they just the easiest ones to reach to, and it stops them having to get into maybe more of the substance of what he's actually saying?
So Republicans have made clear that they want to turn Mamdani into a villain, much in the same way that they tried to do with Ocasio-Cortez in 2018 when she was first elected, and much of what they did with Nancy Pelosi when she was House Speaker and she was the scary San Francisco liberal. A lot of this is all the same playbook, and they've run before, and it can be effective in that you are tagging somebody with scary labels. For people who are not as tuned into politics with these people, put them next to each other with some scary voiceover and some scary music. And then there you go. So we know Republicans are going to do this and are already doing that. And I think what is going to be really, and moderate Democrats have said they're concerned about it. They think it's a problem, particularly, as they're trying to edge their way back into winning over Latino voters, particularly in a place like Florida, where there's all kinds of very resonant and real memories associated with communist leaders in other parts of Central and South America, where, that might actually be a very effective line of attack. But I think that when you talk to Republicans privately, or when they don't attach their name to what they say, there is a real concern about what Mamdani represents in his relentless focus on cost of living and affordability. And I do think what's fascinating about that race is that so much of what the New York City election was run on in 2021 with Eric Adams was all about crime and public safety. Yeah. And he could have gone that route because crime is still listed for New Yorkers as a top concern. But his sort of relentless, almost comical level of commitment to cost of living, when you talk to Republicans, they say that is scary. Yeah. Because that was really effective. And not only was it effective, it rocketed somebody who was at 0% in the polls to now being mayor of New York with 50%, behind him. And he did that because of what he talked about, which was very tangible, values-driven changes to making New York City more affordable. And that was really appealing to people. And I think there were some really interesting Republicans I've had conversations with about who said, if we ignore that at our peril. We have to figure out how to address people's very real continuing cost of living concerns in these midterms. Otherwise, we are screwed. And it's going to be fascinating to see how Republicans try to do that, because you still have Donald Trump, who was on Fox News just a day or two ago, insisting that the economy is doing great. It's better than ever before, because it is in his character to go out and sell what he is doing. It's very hard for him, just sort of as a public figure, to express empathy. That is not a strength of his. And so it's going to be really interesting to see how Republicans try to figure that out, because even though, yes, they can tag him as a socialist, they can, attack him on his stance on Israel, I think that what he is very good at is finding a way of connecting these very real kitchen table issues that people have in a very accessible and human and authentic way. And so, yeah, if Democrats can figure that out, it'll be a really interesting midterms. The question is, can they actually do that?
We hear so much about things like CPAC, so many different right-wing influencers around and podcasts, and then think tanks as well, and Project 2025 still lingering, the Heritage Foundation. Where are Democrats getting their ideas from, though? What's their answer to that whole world of right-wing? I mean, I don't know if they're necessarily great thinkers, but they're doing a lot of thinking. What's the answer to that on the Democratic side?
Well, I think your podcast brethren at Pod Save America would say that they are doing at least some of that.
Okay.
They just hosted last week their first what they called Crooked Con, so a gathering of a lot of elected officials and activists and strategists to try and bring people into a room to be what they themselves told me was the CPAC of the left, because they acknowledged we have not been very good at gathering Democrats into a room to talk to each other. And, it's interesting because if you sort of zoom out a little bit, I mean, so much of what drove Democratic intensity in politics in the last 20 years was really centered around Obama. I mean, he was this singular figure who got people excited and also embedded into the culture in such a way that he was the cool thing. It was cool as a young person to have the Obama t-shirt, to have the Obama poster. And since that time, there hasn't really been any effort to sort of replicate or pick up the mantle from Obama. And so that vacuum has left a lot of, allowed for Republicans, but also because Republicans were losing, they spent all this time building up these different networks and sort of constellation of Republican groups to try and figure out what to produce next. So it started with the Tea Party, but then it's manifested in all kinds of different ways. CPAC, Turning Point, which was obviously led by Charlie Kirk, really focused on young people. They've been forced to, by dint of losing, to figure out how to try and take over in some of these spaces. And they've done a far more effective job in media as well. I did a story back a couple months ago about Democrats losing the online war, the echo chamber war. And even just looking at something as simple as the top 10 most popular podcasts on Spotify, this was back in February, I think 6 or 7 of them were right coded or were conservative coded in some ways. And Democrats had one. It was Ezra Klein. And so I think that they have figured out that maybe this is a problem. And so we are seeing, there's some traditional places that have existed for many years, but have waned in sort of their power. There's the Center for American Progress is, a think tank that's been around for a long time. They still exist. They're still doing things. But there are new things that are trying to pop up. You've got things like Crooked Con, which kicked off just last week. But you also see things like this organization called Searchlight, which is a new think tank that launched over the summer. And it's sort of pitching itself as we need to get Democrats off of talking about unpopular things, particularly things like social issues that, most of the country isn't there on yet, particularly something like transgender rights. They're an interesting one to watch. They're trying to insert themselves into defining what this new primary is going to be about. And some other ones? I'd say those are CrookedCon and Searchlight are the newest ones of late. Welcome PAC, which is affiliated with Third Way, which is another sort of center-left, Clintonian group that's trying to sort of assert itself more aggressively. They're also in the picture. But I think a lot of this is going to come from the presidential primary in 2027. So much of where Democrats go is going to be who is the leader that catches fire and takes off. And that will drive a lot of where the ecosystem goes from there.
That brings me nicely to the final question I had for you, actually. And so on a basic level for my own sanity, I'd like there to be some newness in American politics, and that's things to shift. And then also we're all in the news space. Clue's kind of in the name. You like new stuff to happen where it can. And we've spoken a lot about ways new stuff can happen, but do you think we're actually going to see a turnover of the Democratic figureheads by 2028, or should we just brace ourselves for Harris and Newsom being the front runners, and we're going to have all these conversations, and guess what? There's these people who are vaguely palatable to super PACs, and the Clintons like them, so they're just gonna do it.
This is the most wide open of a Democratic Party primary in decades. Mm-hmm. There is no obvious inheritor, next person. It is truly wide open in a really fascinating way. And I think you should brace yourself for everything. I think you should brace yourself for 3 debate stages.
Yeah.
I don't know if you guys remember this from 2019 when we had to watch multiple hours of debates because there were so many people running for president. I think we're going to see that again. And I think you can expect that we are going to have some surprising new faces. Pete Buttigieg was the mayor of South Bend, Indiana. I remember riding along in his bus across Iowa when there was 2 or 3 people showing up to events, and then he ultimately won that state in the caucuses during the primary. Mamdani, again, nobody knew who he was a year before. He's now mayor of New York. These things are still very, very possible. And I think that because of that, it begs for people to then think, why not me? And then we're going to see a massive field. Who Democratic primary voters ultimately pick? Whole other question. Yeah. I think that this is still a party that is obsessed with trying to move on from Donald Trump. And, presumably he will not be running for president in 2028. So no matter what, it won't be Trump, but it will be Trumpism that will be on the other side. And I think that they are still pretty obsessed with the notion of electability, which was you just could not escape that word in 2019 and 2020. And that was all of Joe Biden's pitch, was he was the most electable. And I think how people define electable in this moment feels very different than what it was in 2020. And I think that will be a lot of fun.
Elena, thanks so much for joining us on American Friction.
Thanks so much for having me. It was really fun to hang out with you guys.
And listeners, thank you so much for listening to American Friction. Yep. Remember, if you enjoy what we do, you can back us on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/American Friction to find out how. There's a link in the show notes. And if you can't back us financially, we get it, but please do go rate, review, and subscribe wherever you're listening to the show. I'm Jacob Jarvis. He's Chris Jones.
I am, yep.
Simon's editing everything. And I stumbled there, so he'll fix that.
Will he?
No, maybe not.
I don't think you
make sense.
Actually, no, Simon, leave that in.
Yeah, leave
all of this in.
Anyway, thanks, guys.
Goodbye.
See you soon.